Hello and welcome. My name is Aaron Stein, Director of the Middle East Program at the Foreign Policy Research Institute in Philadelphia, and you are listening to the Middle East Brief, a podcast focused on developments in the Middle East and why they matter for U.S. foreign policy. Be sure to subscribe to the Middle East Brief on iTunes and Spotify, and sign up to receive FPRI's Weekly Insights newsletter, where a link to the show will be delivered every 2 weeks straight to your inbox at www.fpri.org. Hello and welcome. Today I am talking to Josh Krasna, a senior fellow at FPRI and a professor at NYU's Center for Global Affairs. Josh, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
I was originally this week going to talk about the explosion in Lebanon. I won't lie to listeners, and we will do an episode on that probably next week. But just as I was getting to send out my podcast invitations, news broke that the Israeli government and the United Arab Emirates had signed, I guess, an agreement, depending on who you're listening to begin the process of normalizing their relations. And I dropped the Lebanon focus and switched over to this. So, Josh, I know it's recent. I mean, we're recording this on Friday. I believe it's about 24 hours after the announcement.
I think a little less, yeah.
A little less. I mean, it's admittedly a little bit of a hot take, but so what are your thoughts on all that transpired yesterday?
Okay, so first of all, it is a big deal. I'll explain in a little while. It's not the biggest deal ever, but it is certainly a big deal, and it's certainly a surprise, which I think is worth noting. And United Arab Emirates and as you said, I mean I think there are some. It's a little bit vague what exactly is going on, but it's pretty clear that we are on track for UAE being the third Arab country to officially recognize Israel and set up diplomatic relations with it. They haven't done it yet, but it looks like it's imminent. And we remember the first one was in 1979, and the second one was in 1994. So we're over 25 years later. We get to the third. So it's a pretty big deal. I mean, it's not the largest country. It has no border with Israel. It's almost 1,000 miles away. It was never. It is not at a state of war in Israel like some of the other Arab states are. But still, it's not an achievement which can be. It's not a paltry achievement. It's a very significant achievement. And I think the situation, or the context in which it takes place, is really fascinating and makes it not only important intrinsically for Arab-Israeli peace, but also kind of like almost a diplomatic case study of how low expectations lead to surprising and perhaps game-changing results.
Yeah, I mean, maybe we can expand upon that a little bit. I mean, the Trump administration played a role in this, and I would say a considerable and perhaps decisive role in help shepherding this along. And this comes, I mean, I can't even quite remember, basically on the heels of the much maligned, I guess, Trump administration peace plan that many thought was dead on arrival.
Yes. So in February, of course, Trump released his peace plan. The peace plan was, I think, in the United States and in the Arab Middle East, viewed with quite a lot of trepidation. It was seen as accepting an Israeli narrative of the conflict and of how the conflict needs to be solved. To a large extent, seemed to, while it embraced the two-state solution, seemed to put the achievement of a two-state solution farther away. And on the Israeli right, and to an extent the American political right, was widely accepted as being, a totally new paradigm, and fell flat. Partially because in the internal Israeli context, it turned into something that was, while all of the political currents in Israel had to welcome it because it really came a tremendous way in Israel's direction, it was seen as sort of a present to Netanyahu to help him cement his political role. It was seen as perhaps an artifact of American internal politics. And it was seen as something in Israel that would actually never come to fruition. But more importantly, it was to a large extent either rejected or received very coldly by all the Arab states, including the United States' close allies in the Middle East. So, of course, it was rejected firmly and vociferously by Jordan, but also Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and especially and in this particular case, and the UAE basically rejected a large part of it, which is the part that was accepting the Israeli concept of annexation of part of the territory in the West Bank. Now, remember that the idea of annexation had basically been brought up by Benjamin Netanyahu just before the second round of Israeli elections, which was in September 2019, and had become a sort of firm issue going into the third set of elections in March. And after the election in March, and after the construction of our government in May, Netanyahu was basically operationalizing the concept that the annexation, or as he called it, the extension of Israeli sovereignty and law over large swaths of the Jordan Valley and of the scattered settlements within the West Bank, was going to occur before the American elections, right? So you have on the one hand, when that was all going on, it began to become clear fairly quickly that the American administration was divided over the wisdom of annexation, and then became more clear in recent months that the American administration, especially after the beginning of widespread of the COVID crisis, but also the spread of the domestic security crisis in the United States, it became clearer and clearer that the Americans were not going to push the Trump plan. And it became clearer to clearer in Israel that the main coalition partners, the Blue and White Party, would not sign on to annexation without the Americans explicitly going along with it. And Netanyahu basically was peddling down the issue of annexation. So the Trump plan was released to a lot of fanfare, was never particularly well received outside of Israel, and seemed to be dead in the water. And suddenly, it was resuscitated in a really, I think, surprising and novel way.
Well, let's talk about that a little bit. I mean, do you think that the point of the Trump peace plan was to play brinkmanship, or do you think that that was an unintended outcome that allowed for, I guess, the space given to the UAE to try and reach compromise on the opening of bilateral relationships, but in exchange for something tangible, like it looks like at least a pause, but I expect that pause to turn into something more sort of like a frozen pause, right? In terms of the annexation of the West Bank and not pursuing it moving forward by the Netanyahu government.
So I'm gonna approach it from the Israeli aspect, and then I'll come around to the American aspect as well. So there is a very strong feeling or a very strong viewpoint in Israel, which I belong to, which is that Netanyahu was never really planning to annex these territories. At one point, perhaps he had received indications, probably from the U.S. ambassador to Israel, that it would be something that was possible. And I think that sort of hit its height when the Trump peace plan was released, and the main incentive for him, of course, was to shore up his base, the right wing base in Israeli politics, and perhaps attract some people in the center of Israeli politics whose position was never that they were, 1,000% behind the two-state solution, but that they felt that there was no political possibility of annexation actually taking place. And smartly, of course, he stressed the issue of the Jordan Valley, which is very widely accepted in Israel, that it needs to be Israel's security border, not necessarily political border, but Israel's security border. And remember that the right wing, the hard right, the settler supporting right, was opposed vociferously to that aspect of the Trump plan. In other words, they liked the idea that the Trump plan would let them annex territories, but they were extremely opposed to the other part of the Trump plan, which was a roadmap towards a Palestinian state. And on the far right, the Trump plan was seen as something that was very dangerous, right? And that the narcotic of the possibility of annexation had deadened the state to the tremendous danger, which on the right was perceived as the acceptance of the idea of Palestinian statehood. So I think that when Netanyahu first brought it up, he was bringing it up for political reasons, and he thought, I think, that the relationship with the Americans, let's say the overall interest in the Arab world in the Palestinian issue was such that sort of there had come together a very good set of circumstances which could perhaps make the annexation possible. And I think that very quickly, I think particularly because of the Jordanian reaction, I think both the Americans and a large part of the Israeli establishment lost their appetite for it. You know, those who ever had it or those who were willing to go with it lost their appetite. And I said, and also in the United States, the objective developments within the United States really narrowed the bandwidth that the American administration had to push the Trump plan. And then you have this sort of interesting issue where Netanyahu went very far out on a limb. He sort of threw these chestnuts in the fire, and now they're burning, and he doesn't know how to take them out. And then you sort of have this very what happened here, this kind of jujitsu move where he was the one who raised the problem, right? He put the annexation issue on the table. The annexation issue became or was framed as the one issue that was preventing the moderate Arab states from coming closer to Israel, and then he pulled it back, out.
Yeah, that's interesting. And how do you think this will play, I mean, domestically? I mean, as it looks from the outside, right, is that, one of the, besides the back channel negotiations that I assume are going on, and I believe that was reported, at least that I read it yesterday, by Axios, and there's probably more out there that I haven't
By
seen yet.
Barak Ravid, who's really has great scoops all the time.
I agree. Yeah. Question I have is, in addition to the back channel, that went through Jared Kushner and I believe is sort of his assistant, Avi Berkowitz, who I mean, I don't mean this in a political way. Like a lot of people sort of viewed as one of these kleptocratic Trump appointees because he's 26 and a very young person, but all of a sudden he's playing a relatively large role in facilitating informal back channel dialogue, but also the op-ed that Yusuf Al-Taiba, the Emirati ambassador to DC, sort of this all-powerful person that a lot of people know in DC because of his relationships around town, ended up writing an op-ed that perhaps set the terms of the debate. What do you think of all this stuff coming together?
Yeah, I think so. There's an interesting thing here, which is I think that there are Arab states who are developing a good relationship with Israel, who are very close to both the Netanyahu government, but more importantly to the Trump administration, and who are probably looking a little bit worried at elections in the United States and what could possibly come out of them. And these countries have already crossed one Rubicon in terms of the fact that they are ready, they are willing, and they have been working with Israel for quite some time. In other words, they feel they have a strategic congruence of interest with Israel, not only, especially regarding the Iranian issue, but not only. Remember that the UAE is probably the most modern, the most technologically savvy, the most advanced state in the Arab states, and has a certain resonance with Israel as the startup nation, as the technological hub, and sort of there's a lot there that the two of them have in common. And the Palestinian issue has always been sort of the glass ceiling that has kept that from going to to perhaps its natural level, right? Because these are states that were never directly participate in war in Israel, don't share a border with Israel, have young populations who aren't as have small Palestinian populations, young populations who don't necessarily view Israel as the source of all evil, who actually, by their autocratic nature, aren't necessarily that interested in public opinion, and by the way, have small publics to begin with, right? I mean, the UAE has out of 10 million people, some 2 million or less who are Emirati born. So the UAE is was sort of poised, if the Palestinian issue could somehow be taken off the table, right, was poised to be making the next move. And here, sort of, as I said, but here sort of an issue had been put on the table that had been posited, as you said, by Al-Otaiba as the one thing that's preventing further normalization. And then that issue became politically unachievable in any case. And then so you have Al-Otaiba who puts it on the table. Netanyahu's really closest and most trusted political and diplomatic advisor is the Israeli ambassador in Washington as well, right? Aron Dermer. So you sort of have this context where you have the American administration who would like a diplomatic achievement and who needs to keep the Trump plan from being a damp squib. You have the Israeli administration who really wants to have a breakthrough with the Muslim world, both for objective reasons, but also for Netanyahu to cement his political position and his image as sort of this diplomatic Svengali before possible elections, because while the actual danger of elections in Israel before August 25th, being declared on August 25th, seems to have rescinded, it's still there. In other words, it's difficult to see this government surviving through the transfer of power in November 2021 from Netanyahu to Gantz. And on the Emirati side, sort of Otaiba sort of put down the terms, right? He said, it's too bad that annexation is on the table. If only it wasn't on the table, we could actually move forward. So sort of all of this came through in the fact that all three of the countries had a real interest that an issue which was not really a viable political issue be taken off the table and then suddenly be able to permit this breakthrough, which, as I said in the beginning, is a significant one, not as significant perhaps as Egypt or Jordan, but certainly significant, and also probably not the last.
As we pivot to sort of the wrap up here, there's talk about other Arab states that may follow in the Emiratis' sort of footsteps, at least, in terms of this. But also, it's still very murky, right? What are the potential pitfalls here to this moving forward? Is it this entirely contingent upon Netanyahu refraining from pursuing annexation, something that he at least rhetorically says he's only put on pause? How will that affect the implementation here as we move forward? Because I do see there to be a lot of potential opportunities for this thing to continue, because I do think both sides want it, but sometimes public opinion does get in the way. And then what are the broader foreign policy implications here? A lot of people are framing this about Iran, but is this really about Iran, or is this about something else?
I'll start out by saying on the Israeli side, yes, the settlers are not happy, but even many of the staunch supporters of annexation, I think, see this as being a fairly big dowry to be given in return for giving up annexation. And in a minute, we'll discuss what giving up annexation was. But let's say this is a deal that if there are actually diplomatic relations set up between Israel and the UAE, and this is all that Israel is going to be requested to forego, I think the vast majority of people in Israel will think this is an excellent, right? In other words, there's the near euphoria in Israel. And by the way, that's perhaps where some of the dangers are, because some of the dangers are that if Israel gets too carried away, and if Netanyahu and his supporters and his minions sort of too much sort of stress this, don't worry, we didn't take annexation off the table forever, and it could come back, which is something that pretty much he and his close advisors have been saying in the past 24 hours. The Emiratis are very smart and shrewd and put themselves out on a limb, and they are not going to be happy if Netanyahu sort of continues to portray this as a strategic achievement, which was received by making a tactical withdrawal. Now, what I think the Emiratis are perhaps depending on, and I think fairly, would be the United States. I mean, I don't know if you saw President Trump, when asked, is this a temporary suspension? Is this seemed to not think that's what it was, right? He did not think, and in Israel, they're very much stressing the difference a little bit between what Trump said and what Netanyahu said, that Trump does not seem to be treating this as that the annexation issue is still on the table and has been postponed. He sees, I think that, as I said, both Netanyahu and MBZ, Mohammed Zayed, are close allies of the Trump administration and don't want to annoy the Trump administration. And of course, if the Trump administration ends up not continuing, then under a Biden administration, the annexation issue is going to go away. So I think it's going to be, as you said, there are some pitfalls. I think that's the main pitfall. The main pitfall is just how serious a undertaking or how serious commitment or guarantees the UAE is going to receive that they're not going to be blindsided in the near to medium future by the Israelis suddenly putting the issue back into play after they've already made the move. I think what we're going to see, one of the ways that we'll see how it's progressing is, apparently, from Israeli reports, official Israeli delegations are going out in the coming days already to the UAE to begin hammering out the agreements. So, in the past, I think we've had issues where, certainly with Egypt, and with Egypt and with the Palestinians, and even with the Syrians, where Israeli delegations met with the other side, and in the end, it took either Jimmy Carter to bring them to Camp David to sort of knock their heads together, get them, or it didn't get there with the Palestinians and the Syrians in the end. Though there were direct negotiations, they didn't get there. But I don't think that's the case here. I think the case here, the issues are not as fast. The countries have already sort of front loaded their willingness to go to the end. And as I said, I think it's probably Israel's game to lose.
I would be remiss if I didn't ask you about one last thing before I let you go here. It's going to be a pivot, and it's only because we were talking about this before I hit record. The other thing that's going on that does actually link the Israelis and the Emiratis together, and the Egyptians for that matter, as long as the Greeks and the Cypriots and perhaps the French and to a lesser extent the Italians, although the Italians are on the fence, which is this question about the East Mediterranean. It's as we speak, there's let's say some friction over the delineation of coastal waters, or at least territorial waters in the Eastern Mediterranean between the Turks and the Greeks. And you mentioned to me yesterday that the Greek foreign minister was in Jerusalem or Tel Aviv, I don't know which one, for meetings along these lines. So perhaps give us a first report about what you were seeing yesterday, or at least hearing yesterday, before we sign off.
Right. So there's been this Eastern Mediterranean Gas Forum, which basically pulls together the countries that you had mentioned as in both a positive way, right? They're all gas producers or potential gas producers in the Eastern Mediterranean who are trying to get together to figure out how to cooperate on this issue. But it's also very much perceived both by the Turks, but also by many of its partners as kind of an anti-Turkish bloc. And the Turks, as you know, the Greeks signed this agreement with the Egyptians, which was basically a contra to the deal that in November the Turks signed with the Sarraj government, delineating their maritime borders. And in sort of a fit of pique against that agreement, which seems to have taken the Turks by surprise, the Turks are sending a gas survey ship escorted by warships into disputed waters with Greece to explore, and Greece has mobilized its forces and perhaps come not very close, but certainly closer, or certainly worryingly close to the possibility of a military confrontation between two NATO states. Now, Israel has in the past decade very much set up kind of a strategic alliance with Greece and Cyprus, which is Cyprus is also, of course, sort of under the Turkish gun in terms of the Turks challenging their maritime claims regarding gas. But Israel has been sort of that has been more of a potential alignment than one that has been militarily directed against Turkey. And we're in a situation now, which is really a fascinating situation where, as I said, two NATO countries and an EU member are in the possible vector of clash, with Israel being quite concerned as well because Israel has gas interests there as well. And Israel has gas interests in cooperation with Cyprus as well. Last year, an Israeli gas survey ship was escorted out of Cypriot waters by Turkish warships. There is a potential here. I don't think it's imminent, but there certainly is a potential here. When there are aircraft and ships at sea in an area where there's a lot of oceans flowing, and the Turkish government and the Turkish military are being quite aggressive and demonstrative of their aggressive posture. You have the possibility of miscalculation. You have the possible accidental clash. So it's kind of interesting. The Greek Prime Minister came here, and what was interesting is just before he came, Israel had released a statement. The Israeli Foreign Ministry released a statement saying that Israel stood by Greece and accepted its view of its claims to its EEZ, which basically put them strongly on the Greek side and with very little leeway sort of regarding the Turkish claims. Now, Israel has in the past tried to sort of not pursue a too openly anti-Turkish a position, because Israel wants eventually, first of all, Israel has significant still economic ties with Turkey, and the economic ties have been good, even as the political relationship has gotten very, very bad. But also Israel, I think, has not abandoned the possibility that one day it will go back to the pre-2002 relationship with Turkey, which was an extremely close political and strategic relationship. So I don't think they feel they're going to go back to where they were in the 90s or in the early 2000s when the two countries actually had a strategic cooperation agreement. But I think they certainly were hoping to return to a point where they weren't countries that were actively rivals to each other, and where they were able to lower the flames of the confrontation between them. And we might be going in a very different direction right now.
Well, thanks for taking my curveball question there at the end.
Okay.
Josh, this has been fascinating and interesting. And as I said at the beginning, we're less than 24 hours since the news broke. And so things may be subject to change, but it's good to get a first take on what's happening. So thanks for coming on the show, and thanks for making time. So with that, Josh, thanks. And thank you, everybody, for listening.